He looked out over a world reduced to dust. His hollow face once carried a name, but it slipped away long ago. He was simply the last human alive. Rather than fooling himself into thinking his name held a meaning any longer, he spent most of his time in the library, buried under books, buried within a concrete tomb. In books, names still held a purpose. He lived in books. He saw them as echoes of humanity. It didn't matter if they were fiction or not. Each one was a fantasy to him now, good or bad. You see, stories held a much different meaning than before. Some were for learning and growing, others for entertainment and escapism, but not so far removed you couldn't find little pieces of yourself in them. Now, there was no more learning, no more growing. Absolutely no potential. I suppose entertainment and escapism were still relevant, but skewed in a way. Even fiction once held this vague sense of emotional attainability, seeping into one's life, but not now. Not in any meaningful way. The books he avoided the longest were those covering his lineage. He was scared. Scared to know why he was the last man alive. Scared to know what they had done to become the last of humanity. Why them? Why him and not someone else? What was their significance? What was his significance? He felt he had none, and maybe it was better that way. For the longest time, he avoided knowing the particulars because it felt like sitting in a room slowly being filled with water while watching infantile memories of splashing in puddles. Knowing exactly how it all came to be wouldn't change a thing. His agony would only burn brighter. But as he aged in solitude, he felt drawn to his family's books. His gnawing fear faded to numbing monotony. At the beginning of civilization, you'd have thought humanity would end in roaring defiance, but no. As the man discovered, it was to end in dull waiting. You'd never have thought the conclusion to humanity would just be patiently waiting up ahead. In the beginning, his family started off just as ordinary as any other. A man with a healthy appetite for a better life was in the right place at the right time. That's the eerie part. The story didn't begin with a monster, just an unexceptional man who got lucky. A plain man who allowed himself to become poisoned with power, and a family who willfully inherited that poison for generations to come. Sitting in a cement shell, separating himself from a planet turned sterile, the last man wondered if he wasn't all that different from his ancestors. It had been so long ago. He didn't quite know of his first memory looking out through the massive dome window, the shelter's only window. It was actually a memory at all, or some sort of thought that crept into his mind one day. He was maybe 5 or 6 years old. His aunt was the one who taught him reading, writing, and arithmetic. But this day was different. Usually they ended with reading, but this day, his reading was distracted by his aunt anxiously fumbling around with a book he'd never seen before. He'd seen the math book. He'd seen the word book. He'd seen many picture books. He liked picture books best. He liked how the tall ceiling in those books was painted blue with white smudges, how the floor was green carpet, and how tall brown twisted things were painted on the walls, just like in the learning room. But this new book was no picture book. No. It looked serious, all dressed up in navy blue and gold lettering. Letters that came together in words he was unfamiliar with. His aunt noticed him in his distraction and ended the reading lesson early. She wore an unfamiliar face of concern as she told him she had a new type of lesson for him today. She was going to teach him world history. These words were foreign to him. Addressing the confusion on his face, she explained, "The world is where all humans used to live. Where animals used to live too. Like the ones in your picture books, but they can't talk like you and me. The world is outside, but it's just a shell now." The last man, just a boy then, began to sob uncontrollably. He didn't understand, he just couldn't grasp what she meant. To him, the shelter was the world. It seemed so big. More than 20 floors he counted, his feet tired just walking from one end to the next, and his voice echoed through the many grand rooms as he sang his ABCs. In his mind, what she meant was all the shelter had gone aside from the learning room. Grandma, Grandpa, Dad, his cousins, and all his other family were gone with it. It was now just his aunt in the learning room. His aunt tried to console him by opening the learning room's towering wood-carven doors to show him the shelter was still there, but he just screamed louder as she walked through the opening. He thought that was it. It was now just him and the learning room left. He couldn't think of anything more terrifying. When his aunt came back in the room, he felt perplexed and then as if he'd been duped. Seeing the distrust sweep through him, his aunt told him to come with her. She had something to show him, something that would make him understand. He followed her through the shelter reluctantly, wondering if this wasn't just another trick. He was surprised when they stood at the looming green door, the one door which he had never been allowed past, the ghostly green door which haunted his dreams and nightmares. Sometimes, in his sleep, he'd walk through the door into one of his picture books, but in others, he'd walk into complete darkness, complete nothingness, and the door would be sealed behind him, locking him in forever, forever alone. When the door opened, he was oddly surprised to see neither. Instead, he was met by a light. Strange light that was much bolder than he'd ever seen, even more so than the light in the Sandy River room. It came from a massive circle in the wall, so tall he had to strain his neck to see the top. He remembered how sickly yellow the light was, and water beating against the circle, then running down, but not collecting at the bottom. He wondered where the water went. As he grew closer, he could see the circle stuck out like the bubbles he got to blow on his birthday. When he reached the edge of the dome, he looked into it. He could see swirls of muddied yellow above and sand with the same sickly color below. Far off, he could see specks moving among gargantuan structures which seemed to reach at the sky. When he asked his aunt what those moving things were, she propped a stool beneath a long, gold, conical tube on stilts and asked him to look through the small glass circle at the end facing him. When he did so, he saw the structures weren't as magnificent as they appeared before. They looked broken, like pieces were missing. Then he saw one of the moving things, but it wasn't a thing. It looked like a human. They, like the buildings, broken too, covered in filth, clothes torn, and bandages all over. He could see terror in their eyes as they looked overhead in the distance. The boy could see a dark, festering mass of yellow in the sky heading toward the human. He could see flaxen showers beat the ground approaching. He saw the human run. It looked like they were trying to outrun the big yellow mess. The boy could see other humans, maybe a dozen, huddled in the buildings, shouting and yelling at the running man. They looked so scared. Sad, too. The human ran fast, so fast, but not faster than the yellow. They looked hurt as the yellow water fell on them, their face twisting as they ran. It looked like the human was bleeding all over. Then the boy was sure of it. The human's skin began to peel. The boy hated what he saw but remained transfixed in morbid curiosity. The human was falling apart with each step. Even after their eyes had melted from their skull, they still kept running. The human ran until there was little left but bones. Then the yellow took those too. When it was all over, the boy fell back. He didn't know what to say. He just sat on the ground for a little while, trying to make sense of what he saw. He declared to his aunt that he didn't like that movie. It was too real. He liked the ones where people didn't look so real, like Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh. His aunt knelt beside him with furrowed brow and deep, regretful eyes. He'd never seen her this way before. "It's not a movie," she told him, her voice shaking. Her voice never shook. "Out there is the world. Those are humans. We are protected by the shelter. They are not." "Why?" the boy asked, teary-eyed. "Why can't they just go in a shelter too? Why are they outside? Why did that happen?" Her face turned stern. "Because they don't have a shelter." "Then why can't they just share ours? We have plenty of everything here, so much space, so much food." "Because they didn't earn it. We did." The last man thought about what his aunt had said many times in his life. When he began reading his family's books, he began to understand. His aunt was wrong. They hadn't earned this privilege. They stole it. At the beginning, his family wasn't so bad. While luck had been a major factor, their wealth was largely built on their own merit. But a man's merit can only take him so far, especially an unexceptional man's merit. The trouble was, they had a taste of power and they wanted more. As generations progressed, they found using the merit of others through manipulation and deceit worked wonders in gaining power. Little by little, so gradually no one even noticed until it was too late, they siphoned resources from the rest of humanity. Monopolies, guised as conglomerates until they own 99% of the world's resources. You'd think claiming nearly the entire world as your own would be the worst part, but no. It was the path of destruction they left along the way. The main concern was always having more power, no matter the cost, and the cost was high. Pollution turned the world barren. The oceans, rivers, lakes, and seas nearly all dried up. Acid rain drenched the earth, and when there was no one left to operate the power plants, there were the nuclear meltdowns. He thought maybe money and radiation weren't so different as he read those books. There's a baseline amount a person can handle. When beyond that, they begin to change fundamentally. The further past that threshold you go, the closer to fatality you come. The last man thought back to before the world's collapse. It was strange. While some hated his family rightfully, others seemed to envy them. They wanted to be like them. His family gave the public scraps every now and again, scraps they fought to the death for. The scraps instilled this false sense of hope that they too could climb to the peak of abundance, but that would never happen. It could never happen. The system was enforced by those who had power, and those who had power always rigged the system in their favor. The trick was not to completely drain hope from the have-nots, while they still have value to be exploited. When it became clear the world would soon enough be uninhabitable, his family began having the shelter built by people who would be consumed by the filth his family left behind. He couldn't help but feel guilty for that. After all, he accepted this position of privilege, the privilege to live a long life in material comfort, comforts provided by those alienated from their benefits. While while the rest of humanity was torn apart by a sick and dying planet. He wondered if his family's poison coursed through his veins, or if he just so happened to be a man born into privilege, scared to die. Was he wrong either way? He'd never know because there were no impartial judges left. The last man visited the window a number of times since he was a boy. The last outsider he saw was broken and bony, too tired to go on. He rooted for them, but they had nothing left. So one day they just stopped moving. Eventually the acid rain took them too. Their bones turned to dust. The man wondered how much of the dust out there was made of bone. Now ancient and settled in silence, the last man looked out through the window, across softly sifting plains of sand, past decayed nubs of a once brilliant city, over rolling dunes. He watched the sun set in shades of putrid yellow rippled with gray. He thought about all the work his family had put into this, all the sacrifices they had made, how so many of those sacrifices had hopes, dreams, and names. He looked out over the decrepit kingdom he had inherited. All they had done was for this, so their lineage could possess all. And in the end, they did.